Hi, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there for the East Coast folks. I know it's getting a little bit late. So I'm Delphine Zerki. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey in our Boston office. I also lead our US Medtech service line, and I am a reformed AI scientist. I hid that for a while, but now it's becoming popular again. So it's been a pleasure to kind of have both of my worlds collide and very much help companies in the medical device space and beyond think about what is generative AI, what is hype, what is not, how can we use it, and more importantly, create value for patients. So I'll spend a few minutes giving you a bit of an overview of what is generative AI. I'll then have Sam come and do some really interesting interactive demos of how GenAI is being used right now at what they do at Level X. And then we'll start our panel and really hear from folks in the industry, both medtech and healthcare technology, on how this technology is starting to get deployed. All right, so first, a little bit of a primer. AI is getting a lot of press lately, but I think it's important to just define what it is. So really, AI is getting a machine to act like a human. You know, nothing more fancy than that. And when I was doing my PhD more than 20 years ago, there was a bit of a debate: should we teach machines with rules, or should we teach machines with examples? We weren't quite sure at the time, and just think about, how do you teach your kids? Rules or examples? But obviously the examples have won. This is what machine learning is. This is essentially giving the machine a ton of examples such that over time it learns the patterns. And then the next debate was, if we give it more examples, is it going to start acting more human-like? And this is really what we're experiencing as of late, are really these very deep learning techniques. You'll, I'm sure, have heard about large language models, which are essentially very, very, very large neural networks that essentially have seen hundreds of thousands of examples and are starting to do really interesting things. What do? They can start writing code. Now, not perfect code, but at least enough to be sort of an assistant to a software engineer. They've started being able to pass the US law and medical licensing exam. Now, interestingly, the technology didn't pass it at the beginning of the year, but since we've upgraded and put more parameters, aka more examples, it started to be able to, to pass these exams. And then, even more excitingly, you can start applying this technology to images and other modalities, as we'll talk about in the panel, and now it's able to win art prizes. So, all exciting. I'm sure you've read about it in the press, but often the question we get is, this is great, but how does it apply to medical technology, and how can we ultimately get value out of it? I'll also say there's definitely a lot of hype in terms of the investors and, in Silicon Valley. But I do like one of this quote that's saying that really AI is finally having its iPhone moment. And again, as an AI scientist, AI worked great 20 years ago, but now finally it's in the boardroom and it's capturing imagination, and it's the right, really, conversations about what it can do and cannot do. So why is GenAI particularly exciting if you are a data scientist? One reason is that, unlike traditional AI, where you really have to fine-tune and train your model for every single task, it's kind of like getting your driver's license every time you drive a four-wheeled vehicle. If it's a sedan, you get your driver's license. If it's a U-Haul van, you get your driver's license, right? That's kind of like how AI has been working up to now. Now with these multitask models, you get your driver's license once, and it really understands what it means to drive a four-wheeled vehicle. Now, it's not always the best driver. This, I'm sure you've heard about hallucination. But over time, you're able to do a lot more with, just putting the effort once and getting your driver's license. It's also quite scalable, meaning you can do a lot of tasks, but you can also apply it to a lot of modalities. So if you played around with DALL-E, you can now use natural language to generate an image. And so that's becoming interesting as we start combining some of those. And then what's really, I think, captured most of the imagination earlier this year was this concept of you can now interact with a machine in a human-like way. And ultimately, I think this is what we'll see in the medical device space, where we can start interacting with customers and HCPs and patients potentially in a more human-like way. Lots of risks, which I'll talk about here towards the end, but certainly knowing that this cannot do complex calculations. It's still not as good as traditional AI and numerical analysis or complex code writing. And then also it does really good in English, very well, I should say, in English, not my native language. but some languages maybe not as well. So there's still a lot of technical considerations as well as risk considerations. So for the purpose of Medtech, we kind of boiled it down. I'm sure you've been in many conversations around what are the use cases. We like to start more with what is it the system can do. And then we like to think about, ultimately, value is in the workflow. So if you can take a workflow and a persona and think about how you can make that person's life a lot easier by not doing repetitive and boring tasks or by giving them a lot of information, this is how you can capture, ultimately, the numbers you see here on this page. It's pretty significant. So this is a bit of the promise of generative AI. This is, by the way, only a quarter of what we think all of AI can capture. But it is ultimately very fast to deploy. So ultimately, that's, we're hoping to start seeing some of that productivity. If we look at the technology itself, I mentioned you have these very large neural networks. And at the end of the day, which I find quite elegant, all it does is it predicts the next word. So if you ask it, would you like A? It will know it's a cup of tea. It knows that because it has a lot of context, a ton of parameters. In this case, it probably understands that it's in the evening, and therefore I don't want a glass of something else. And what it does here is it really finds all the words that are close in space, and so you can start thinking about ways to compare things to each other, but also predicting what could be the next token. And you can start applying that to other concepts that are not necessarily natural language, like a patient journey. If you take claims information or EMR data, you can treat it as a sentence, right? The journey we go through in the care pathway is a sentence, and every event is a word. And now you can use the same technology to start predicting what might be the next medical event, or the likelihood that a patient might not adhere to a treatment. And you can extend that concept to really anything that is very complex, unstructured data. And by unstructured, we mean we don't know how many words are in the sentence. We just don't know how many events are in a patient journey. And same thing with images. They're quite unstructured. And so the pharma companies have started to really do interesting things with foundational models around treating proteins, for example, like language, and being able to start predicting new drugs that way. There is a question for our industry, which is, what's the equivalent of the protein for Medtech? And you'll hear in the panel, I think GE, for example, is doing some really interesting research with diagnostic imaging. I'm sure many of you can think of what's the data coming out of my device and how may I start representing that with this kind of AI. And based on that, you can extract some really interesting insights. So that's typically the GenAI you might not hear or read about in the popular press. But ultimately, we do think this is quite powerful for the industry. The other two kinds are, again, probably what you're more used to, playing around with ChatGPT, for example. But think of it as either a really great intern, so somebody who can come and write something on your behalf, a first draft. Marketers can use that, for example, or software engineers. Or it could be a really good expert, somebody who can retrieve information on your behalf, collate it together, synthesize, and give you some answers to your questions. Again, sometimes they're not necessarily always accurate, so you need to make sure you can check the source. But in the end, it does save you time and potentially helps you generate insights that you might not have been able to generate if you didn't have access to that data. And so applications here are, as we'll talk about, very much in the enterprise if you think about all the data that's being siloed that we don't have access to, I think that's quite exciting to think about, but also for our customers and HCPs. All the data that they could be starting to generate insights from. So let's talk about a little bit of the use case view. I will say you probably have seen many of these slides. What's the best use case? The answer is we don't know. Nobody knows. It's just getting generated as we speak. But one thing we can tell you is that speed is a strategy. So for the companies, as you'll hear in this panel, who are starting to play around with the technology, they are the ones who really are seeing, is it actually changing the workflow? Because that's the promise, right, is if you get a first draft, you save 10 minutes. If you are an R&D persona and you can now go synthesize all the research that's been written in the last 2 weeks, you can generate better insights. But in reality, is it happening? Right? And I think that's the speed as a strategy, which is, that technology certainly can be great, but ultimately be putting sort of all the right infrastructure around to be able to see, am I really getting value out of that technology? And is the user, telling me how to improve it? Where I will show you in a second demo, and where we're seeing quite a bit of uplift in Medtech, is in the Rep Copilot. So many of you, I'm sure, have a CRM. Many of you are trying to get your rep to use a CRM. It's not easy. It's not necessarily a very natural, interface that they like to interact with. But they complain. They're fetching information all the time and spending 20 to 30% on non-sales time. So this is Rep Copilot that we've created for a company. I know it's very hard to read, so I'll kind of tell you what the rep here is asking. The first question is, which account should I engage with? Pretty basic. So the technology tells it which account based on estimated procedure volume, so it's actually getting information from claims, as well as the share of wallet. Then it's asking for a graph of procedures over time. So it's starting to give it really interesting information that you wouldn't really have in a CRM. It's also asking for which doctor to interact with. And so now it's going to fetch information about prior interactions and ways that the user has been successful in interacting with a physician. It sometimes asks for things it shouldn't ask for. So right now it's asking for details on a patient. The system says, nope, I can't give you that detail. So important to build risk in it. And then finally, it's asking to draft an email. Normally it would ask the marketing department to draft an email, and again, you can think about in the workflow how you're saving quite a bit of time. Now again, this is still very much in pilot mode. Many companies are playing around with it, but we are seeing, unlike some other technologies, that reps are adopting it at scale. So 80% really enjoy the technology, which is not something we've seen in the past with other kinds of next best action. So we'll switch in the panel to how this can also be used in the products that you create or in services. But I did want to highlight a couple of areas that I think are quite exciting. In the image processing space, I think this is where we've seen AI already take off. A lot of FDA-approved algorithms, and again, you'll hear there's some really interesting technology now that we can deploy to make this even more accurate. There is also quite a bit in terms of using voice. Again, interacting in a more natural way with the device, being able to write notes at the end of an encounter that, frankly, physicians don't necessarily enjoy writing. And so you'll see here, this is, borrowed from one of our panelists, Rebecca, from Nuance Microsoft, how that works in practice. This is technology that's been deployed already, quite fast, I might say, faster than I think most of the device technologies. And there's a conversation happening between a physician and a patient, and it's able to capture that, and it's able to put it into a structured note, a SOAP note, into the EMR. Now, it's doing that with the same technology that I was describing in terms of predicting the next word. And in the end, it's saving 7 minutes per encounter, which is quite a lot for a physician. That means they can go home sooner, or in some cases, they can see up to 1 or 2 more patients a day. Now, why is this important for our industry? Because physicians are using this technology, and therefore their expectation is rising in terms of how to interact with devices. And we all know they don't like clicking, right? They don't like switching screens. So this is something to think about as well, is how can we start, maybe not necessarily in the regulated yet, but around the device is an interesting thought. We get asked, how do you prioritize? It's pretty easy. Go with where there's going to be most value and less pain. So anything that is internal productivity, a workflow exists, and you can sort of help somebody with a very boring task, tends to be where we see a lot of folks adopt it. But we are seeing also a lot of really interesting R&D investment, much more in the top left, around digital twins, for example, and how to understand that. I will finish on risks, because I do want to make sure this audience understands we are a regulated industry, and it is very important to experiment with it, but also to have all the risk guardrails. And what we like to say is, don't just stop at the risk. Think about how to then mitigate those risks with responsible AI guidelines. So I won't read through all of this, but certainly we are seeing very forward-thinking companies involve their legal team, their compliance team, very early in the process to think about, what are guardrails we should put in place and how do we innovate around that. So with that, we will now get even more interactive demos with Sam Glassenberg at Level X, who will talk to us a little bit about the R&D persona.
Great. Thank you. We're going to use this mic. Oh, perfect. Sorry, I have my examples have apparently overwhelmed the AV laptop, so we're switching to mine. We'll see how it goes. So thank you, Delphine. Eager to show a number of additional examples of GenAI in medtech and healthcare. As we continue to ask ourselves what GenAI means for the medtech industry, as employees, in a workforce, as engineers, as educators, as marketers, I'm happy to share that there's an industry that has embraced GenAI wholeheartedly and provides lessons, both promising and warning, that are directly applicable to medtech, and that is the video games industry, which provides us with a useful model of both how to approach and how to leverage GenAI. Instead of viewing GenAI as a threat, employee in the video games industry, artists, engineers, overwhelmingly are looking at this as a healthy and welcome evolution of 3 decades of innovation. And so putting fear aside, the games industry is using GenAI in ways that are directly applicable to medtech, both in terms of how we train AI and how we use it. So a little bit about me. I spend my days at the intersection of video games and medicine. I run a company called Level X. We use game technology to accelerate the adoption curve of new products in healthcare. So imagine 1 million medical professionals playing our games. We work with major medtech companies like Medtronic, Boston Scientific, J&J, to use game tech to help them sell, market, and train on their products. So to be clear, I don't sell GenAI or any AI stuff, but I'm a beneficiary of GenAI, and we've learned a lot of lessons in using GenAI to create training content for doctors that I think everybody here can learn from. And so I've spent my career before healthcare in video games at companies like Lucasfilm and Microsoft. And while most industries are looking at GenAI with some fear and trepidation, the games industry is proving to be this exemplar for how we adopt it. And why is that? I'll show you. You can feel free to cheer for games that you've played. This was the best looking video game character in the world in 1989. And in the games industry, we've grabbed onto the Moore's Law curve, and we haven't let go. So this was the best looking video game character when I joined Microsoft 20 years ago. My team's job was to figure out how to go from that to this. So today I can buy Call of Duty, I can zoom into the eye of one of the characters. This is the level of detail we create in a modern video game. And thanks to Moore's Law, every 5 years, the video game hardware supports an order of magnitude more content and an order of magnitude more detail, which creates a huge problem for us. The game's price stays the same. So the only solution is you've got to make your employees and engineers, your artists, 100 times more effective. You can't make this using the same tools you used 5 years ago. And so if you're, let's say, trying to recreate the entire city of Chicago, right, down to the beer can on the ground, right, you cannot do that using old tools. You can't do that by hand. And in every generation, the video games industry figures out how do we make our artists and designers orders of magnitude more productive, like Delphine was talking about, productivity. Going from drawing pixels to robust tools that let artists model from virtual clay to, but even that's too efficient. We are creating procedural tools that allow artists to just draw lines to create roads and fill everything in between it, and it's the output of these tools that we're using to train the next generation of GenAI-based solutions for the next round of video games that you'll see. So in the last generation, we perfected what we call procedural content generation. An artist can just drag lines and just make buildings, make whole cities. This is another example. An artist can just move a mountain when they're making a game now, and the math will fill in the underlying details. So this is the expectation of every artist in the video games industry. Any manual work that you were doing 5 years ago is going to be automated. So you have to continually move up the stack and become more productive. And so these tools are directly applicable in healthcare. So at level X, we're using the same mathematical procedural techniques to create content to train doctors. So in this example, we're creating a mathematical model not of a city, but of plaque psoriasis that allows an artist to just tweak dials at the direction of a dermatologist and create any variation of the disease. We want the skin cracks deeper, make the region between them look wetter. The imagery just emerges from the mathematical model. And so what we're able to do is use this content to train doctors' brains how to recognize skin disease at any severity, on any part of the body, on skin of any color, under any lighting environment. None of these images are real. All of these are just procedurally generated images generated by our engine mathematically. And we use the same thing to model body movement. So mathematical models that allow artists to overlay a tremor at any frequency or amplitude on any body type or any body part to train neurologists how to recognize the subtle difference between a Parkinsonian tremor or a tardive dyskinesia tremor. And it's this procedurally generated content that we're using to train the next generation of GenAI generated physics and animation. So this guy is what your video game characters are going to look like next year. He's built on a GenAI system that has been trained on the procedural stuff, trained on procedural data. So we're taking the procedural systems that we used in the last generation and using it to train the AI systems. This will get relevant for med device in a second. So of course we can use these GenAI methods to create better content to train doctors with more realistic patients, but this idea has much broader implications. So, for example, we can use last generation's procedural methods to create synthetic data to train smart AI systems. So here's a screenshot from our gastroenterology game. You can download it from the App Store. But since we're procedurally generating that image, we know exactly where everything is. We know the position of the camera. We know the tools, the lights, the anatomy. And so we can use this data to train smart AI systems, systems that know where you are in the procedure and know exactly what's happening. So just like in games, we're using the last generation technology to train generative AI tools, we can do the same in medtech. And we can use it to train smart medical devices. So instead of tagging surgical videos, as best we can in India or wherever to generate training data, now you can determine the data you want and the tags that you want, and you can theoretically generate it procedurally the same way we do in video games, and automatically generate what it looks like under X-ray, under ultrasound, and so forth. So we can train smarter, unbiased AI systems that know how to find cancer, know how to interpret ultrasound. Which brings me to the next, what I'll say, overlooked application of generative AI. And there's this misperception that is also directly applicable in healthcare. So there's this misperception that GenAI's current value is replacing the engineering grunt work, the kind of manual, simple programming tasks that you were going to outsource to India anyway. This is actually less interesting. What we found is that GenAI allows you to solve your hardest technical problems in orders of magnitude less time. In advance, I'm going to apologize. I'm going to skip over a lot of technical detail here. Simulating light bouncing around a scene is incredibly complex and compute intensive, but it's critical in games and surgical simulation. We want to create complex materials like skin. In movies, you've got 6 hours to generate every frame. In a game, including games for doctors, we have to generate 60 frames a second. There are ways that you can pre-compute a lot of this, but the math behind it is very complex. So you can have realistic lighting in real time, but the techniques, one of them is called pre-computed radiance transfer with spherical harmonics. The math behind this is shared with quantum mechanics. I'm happy to delve into it with you over drinks later. But at level X, we wanted to integrate this technique into our games, but estimated it would be about 4 to 6 months of engineering work. With ChatGPT, did it in a weekend. Hey, ChatGPT, write code to rotate the 6th order spherical harmonic vector. ChatGPT goes, well, I can rotate a 2nd order vector easily, but 6th order is a complex task that requires a deep understanding of spherical harmonics. I don't care, ChatGPT, do it anyway. Well, okay, fine, here's the math, but in order to actually solve this math, we need to compute a Wigner D matrix for that. Okay, ChatGPT, you've got a Mathematica plugin, use it. Boom! In a matter of hours, the whole thing is up and running on real patient data. And over the weekend, the next weekend, we're developing novel methods for simulating bone drilling that runs on a cell phone. So the bottom line is med device companies can be using ChatGPT to tackle some of your hardest technical problems. And we use ChatGPT to create tons of training content for doctors. That's our business. And the results are mind-blowing, in some cases a little bit too mind-blowing. And this gets to Delphine's last point. Herein lies one of the major problems with LLMs. ChatGPT, can you come up with a multiple choice question that combines cultural references with dermatology knowledge that a professional dermatologist would find intriguing and challenging? Sure. What iconic singer was known for the distinctive mole on her face, which was actually a kind of benign tumor called a neurofibroma? Marilyn Monroe, Cher, etc. Oh, that's a good question, right? That's good. Except here's the rub. All the content highlighted in red is medically wrong. Highly believable, but wrong. Why? Because ChatGPT is optimized for believability over accuracy. And you need to make sure that your editors and your peer reviewers know that what they're reviewing is AI generated. Because ChatGPT will generate content that a human writer would never say with confidence if they were unsure of it. And so this bigger problem in honing generative AI models with humans. Humans can tell what is believable much better than they can tell what's accurate. And this is why precise control over the input data set is so important, just like we talked about earlier. So just like the video games industry learns its lessons from film, there's a great deal Medtech can learn from game development. Looking forward to exploring more on the panel. Delphine, thank you. Thank you for having me. You can switch back now, the slides. Perfect.
All right, so I will now, thank you, Sam. Yeah, that was fun. So that's the R&D persona. I'm sure now you can all go to your R&D engineers and tell them that ChatGPT is going to solve all their problems. I'm going to now invite our panelists on stage, and we'll talk a little bit about what's actually happening in the walls of medical device company and healthcare technology company. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. So without further ado, we might do a quick round to first have the audience understand how are you using generative AI in your companies. I'm going to skip you because you've already answered that question. I'll go to Rebecca first. Interested to hear, at this point, how much you're still in pilot phase versus really ultimately scaling. And, we know you're using it obviously for your customers, but also you're using it internally.
So very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. So I sit here representing Nuance and Microsoft. We have decades of experience using artificial intelligence, and we did this before it was cool. And we did it particularly in voice recognition. So we currently have about 550,000 clinicians globally that are using the Dragon speech recognition technology. The next generation of that product is an ambient offering, which is what you saw in that video, which actually allows the natural conversation between the patient and the provider to occur, and then a note gets generated. That offering has been in market now for 3 years. We have deployed it to thousands of clinicians, and its most recent development has been announced to go GA actually today at HLTH this morning at 9 a.m. We had an announcement with one of our customers, Atrium, on the West Coast. And we are now able to do this and do this within seconds. So the clinician actually gets the note in seconds, is able to look at it, have it integrated into the EHR, and then move on, which is a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment. So we did a combination of piloting of this and private preview, which you can talk about in a second, but we're actually deployed at scale.
Randy, curious to hear from your end.
I don't think our answer is nearly as exciting. I'm Chief Solutions Officer at Orthogonal. We help medical device companies develop software as a medical device, connected device systems, and digital therapeutics. Or as we say, all the software that's part of a device except any software that's physically inside the device. And the answer is we're not really using it right now because what we're trying to do is figuring out what are all the hurdles we're going to have to clear to actually be able to implant generative AI inside a regulated device. So I think while we see all these use cases, and we can get into this, of generative AI creeping up to the device and right to it, there's going to be a very big moat things that we're going to have to cross, and we'll talk about what are some of those barriers we're going to have to remove and what's it going to take to do it.
Thank you. So Parminder at GE, how do you use it currently?
Hey everyone, this is Perry. I'm the Chief AI Officer at GE Healthcare. So prior to that, I was leading a lot of foundation models at Amazon 6 months back. So things similar to ChatGPT, like Amazon Bedrock and other components as well. So talking about GenAI, I would say while it's in its nascent stage, but it is mirroring a pivotal change similar to what I would say data aggregation or synthesis or data lakes would have played 5 years back. We are using it for a wide array of applications, both on product development and productivity improvement, though all of those are still in the initial evaluation phases. On the product development side, we are leveraging GenAI and exploring different options throughout the entire cycle of image product generation, all the way from image acquisition, talking about image quality augmentation, doing patient monitoring, and then even to the clinical decision support. Obviously, different projects are in different phases. For instance, we are already using GenAI and some of those technologies for data or image augmentation, some of the demos that we saw. So some of those technologies actually kind of power how we build our AI solutions. You can talk about style transfer. For instance, the image that's acquired from ultrasound, how do we transfer that to CT and MR? So I think those are already cases that we are looking into. Now, for this year's RSNA, similar to Rebecca's comment, I think you'll see a lot of those use cases on reducing the mundane task or repetitive task with note-taking, multimodal data aggregation, and synthesis, with a focus on how do we solve those problems for the longitudinal view of the patient, where we are actually focusing on some of the care pathway problems, for instance, related to oncology and other use cases as well. Now, talking about GenAI, how it's used in production, I would say as was the case with deep learning or machine learning 10 years back, it'll start with a lot of operational efficiency side of things. How do we improve bedside monitoring? How do we improve or streamline the EMR? How do we actually improve the scheduling and protocoling processes? And then as we build that, as we build components in a more responsible way, you would start to see them being used in actual healthcare mainstream tasks as well.
You need to turn it on.
So in Johnson & Johnson, we view it as for innovation, we have to go through stages or levels. I'll call it as 3 levels. The first level is where there's no direct, immediate patient impact when you use GenAI. And that could be examples of, I think it was mentioned earlier too, things like reading a clinical study and generating a report out of it, preparing a regulatory submission or helping the preparation of regulatory submission. So we're well into that for sure inside Johnson & Johnson. We have an alternative to ChatGPT that people started using. So that's what I call as kind of level 1, stage 1. Then stage 2 or level 2 would be where you're trying to now impact product design or technology design. And that could be things like doing industrial design for a capital equipment using generative AI. And I think we're starting to implement some approaches or experimentation there as well, or code, writing code. There's groups that are experimenting with things like GitHub. And then the third level is where I think it's really, really interesting, and that's when you're actually impacting a clinical outcome, maybe perhaps through generating a treatment plan. And I think there's examples in the United States where hospitals are, for example, using generative AI to predict sepsis based on all the information that's available to the hospital system for that patient. And the last stage where I'll give an example is where you're making an intraoperative suggestion to the physician or the surgeon. And for that, for example, we are in cardiovascular, we treat atrial fibrillation, where you go in through a catheter into the heart, you map the heart, and you essentially apply energy to treat the cardiac tissue that causes atrial fibrillation. Today, the way you do it is that you map the heart, you go in and you ablate certain sections, and it's by kind of how you learn it as a physician and an electrophysiologist. But what we were able to do is we were able to collect 75,000 patient data. And when you analyzed the data, we were able to see that you can develop algorithms that can predict, based on what the physician did, if that patient will have a symptom-free outcome post-surgery. Today, when you do it, the only kind of feedback you have as a physician is you ablate the tissue and you see if there's still electrical signal from the heart, and you do more or less. But what we envision is very, very soon, we will be able to put algorithms in there that will tell the physician where to ablate based on what the algorithm is seeing from that specific patient. So I think that will be a very typical use case example of the level 3, I will call it, as intraoperative help for the patient.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Rebecca, since your product's been out now for at least 8 months, I'm curious about the types of use cases that physicians have been using it for, and is that what you had planned originally, or are you getting surprised by the way they use it?
So, interesting question. So we combine, I mentioned this conversational AI, the ambient, and then recently have overlaid some of the GenAI capabilities to actually supplement we're sitting on 14 million provider-patient encounters. And so the output is pretty good. When we initially went to private preview with this most recent version of the offering, which is instantaneous, we saw the doctors using the technology, in the particular case of this one client, 85% of the time, so 85% of their encounters. It was interesting, one of the doctors on the first day of using this thing had about 20-something encounters, and for 19 of them, he used the technology, but for 2 of them, he didn't. And so we asked, we said, hey, why didn't you use it? He's like, oh, no, I used it. But these were pediatric visits, and if you know anything about pediatric visits, they're highly templated. And so the generative AI and the ambient AI output that is in the form of a note, he said, oh, I actually used it as a memory aid. I was like, oh, interesting. Like, not something we had anticipated, because we thought they would use it and automatically put it into the EHR. But this was actually a different use case that we picked up as we ran the private preview.
Yeah. I think it illustrates nicely speed as a strategy, because you innovate very much on the
and you
in the
need
field.
to you need to do it responsibly, because the users will use it in ways that you might not fully anticipate. Memory aid is not something we had anticipated. So.
I'm curious now in terms of specifically for Amit and Parminder. I think many questions we get from Medtech companies is, how do you get started? Is this, sort of every user can innovate? Is this a very centrally led effort? Can you talk a little bit about at G and J&J, how do you, how are you able to coordinate across business units and more corporate?
I can start. So I would say we employ a hybrid approach where it's a combination of central-led and business unit-led development as well. For instance, when we are talking about any of the core capabilities related to platform or reusable components or capabilities like large language models, large vision models, or advanced visualizations, that is something we work really closely with our business units as well. Perfect example for that is, I think, anything that's to do with our foundation services or components, that's something that we have more of a builder capability. For instance, recently we have been building CT as well as ultrasound, foundational vision models at a high level. A perfect example for that is our recent 510K clearance and CE marked, which is CT deep learning auto segmentation algorithm. If we look into that algorithm, it helps in streamlining the entire delineation process of organs at risk, so that you can make sure that the radiation therapy goes to the tumor and you're minimizing the impact on the surrounding tissues. Now, if we look into this entire process, just getting this delineation, radiologists spend 3 hours on an average. With this algorithm, we are cutting that down all the way down to 12 to 15 minutes. And it's still radiologist and human in the loop. And we did a follow-up study, and what we found was 93% of the time, they actually went with the options that were given out by the system in itself, and they made minor tweaks as it revolved around as well. So I think these are some of the components or examples of where building these capabilities become really useful. The other end of the spectrum is starting from business units and then making it more enterprise or central. Recent acquisition of Caption Health. So we had a Caption Health acquisition earlier this year, and just last week we announced its integration into our wide array of ultrasound products, so which really helps clinicians do real-time guidance for ultrasound, primarily focusing on respiratory components. And now the idea is, as part of the central pillar, we want to take it to other parts of the ultrasound and even have this AI-enabled real-time guidance capabilities to take it to MR, CT, and other modalities as well. So I would say it's a balance of the two.
So just to orient the audience, so Johnson & Johnson in Medtech has 4 core businesses: cardiovascular, vision, general surgery, and orthopedics. So we're very, very broad. Our approach is, I think, similar to what you described. So we believe from an innovation model where you need clinical domain knowledge, it has to stay with the verticals. It has to stay, for example, with orthopedics if you need that capability, understanding the clinical domain. And if it doesn't require clinical domain knowledge, we believe any capability should be considered to be a horizontal for MedTech. Just recently, in the last 6 months or so, we decided that we view software as a horizontal capability within MedTech. In the past, each of our franchises had their individual software capabilities. So we now believe that because of the importance of things like cybersecurity, the things like that coming in, each team doing that on their own doesn't make a ton of sense, both from an innovation standpoint, but also from our customers, our payers' perspective. You don't want to approach a hospital with different systems around security, for example. So we view AI as one of those horizontals within the software horizontal, so that we have a general approach that everyone can benefit from, but the clinical domain knowledge, if it's needed, it still has to be very well linked with the horizontal.
So now a question for the more software companies here who are already 100% software. What have you learned with developing generative AI? Is it any different than traditional AI or other analytics? And I'm looking at Sam and Rebecca and Randy, yes.
I can't comment. We're not deep in generative AI, but I think we've seen this show before many, many times in this industry. All we do in Medtech develop new technologies and then figure out how to integrate them into medical devices in a way that we're confident is safe and effective. And we basically take each new technology and we de-risk it. Right? We go through every angle and figure it out. So we saw this with, I'm sorry if anyone was in my session last year, I cited this, the first article in 1979 about using a microcomputer in a medical device, explained concepts like if-then statements, because how would you know what you could do with software? How would you control it? Well, it has these logical functions. When we did our first mobile application submission to the FDA, we had to do a human factors test at the request to prove that a user could successfully download and install an app from the App Store, because they weren't sure that was the truth. We've now gone through this with pre-machine learning, artificial intelligence, computer-aided diagnosis for things like breast imaging. We're now pretty far along the way, although we're still getting there in terms of machine learning. And so we're sort of at the starting block again with generative AI. The good news is there's a lot of templates, and we've learned a lot, particularly, I think, from the machine learning experience. But it's going to be a process.
Rebecca, you developed your product much faster than prior products. Any unlocks for those in the audience who want to go at that speed?
So to reiterate your concept of speed provides competitive advantage, a couple of thoughts I would leave you with. First of all, the speed at which people have looked at, adopted, and tried to engage with GenAI is jaw-dropping, right? And the ability to harness that to actually solve real problems is critical. And we've very much focused on this very vexing problem that is clinical documentation in workflow. And so the idea was to leverage the footprint we had, but accelerate the ability to create notes that were good enough, using all the knowledge we had to date, overlaying GenAI to actually increase the quality of the note and get it in front of providers fast. And we did it at a very fast clip, and we engaged with a certain set of customers in a private preview exercise. and learned tremendously. I mentioned the one example of the memory aid as something we learned. There were a few other things that we learned around the ability of the models to process certain types of encounters, and it meant we adjusted the models as a result of that. So the speed of getting it to market, the speed of learning, and the ability to very quickly validate in a context where you have to do it responsibly, and I know we're going to be getting to that question, and making sure that you are thinking through the compliance, the risk issues, any adjustments to the model that need to happen as you're deploying it is critical.
I think the big reason why GenAI is different from previous, I mean, yeah, we've all been using AI for decades. The video games industry has been using it since the 80s for making enemies in video games. We've been using it for data analysis and whatnot. But the big difference is with GenAI, in order to do great things, you don't need a dedicated AI engineer. So, and I think I can't even tell you how big of a deal this is, right? That historically, like, yeah, you could use AI to, distill insights from huge amounts of, let's say, game data to try to distill user and player insights. And using it required AI engineers and a lot of heavy lifting. And today, we're hopscotching all of that by just creating LLMs where we can just, our employees, a game designer, an artist, an engineer wants to ask questions of our, data from our million players. They can just literally have a conversation with the data. And that's groundbreaking. And we're able to set that up without needing dedicated AI engineers. So it just, the scalability is orders of magnitude greater.
Do you predict there will be less AI scientists?
No, they're just going to be, no. We can look at plenty of examples in games. I'll use the example of graphics, right? That like in the early days of game development, you needed a graphics engineer to draw a triangle on a screen. And now, a kid in school can basically make a video game by dropping things in. That graphics engineer is even busier than, she was 20 years ago because now she's figuring out all the crazy stuff I was showing you.
You have to figure out how to go hire more AI people then.
Just moving up the stack. That's the theme. We're moving up the stack.
To do it faster.
Faster.
The speed at which these things are evolving and learning and improving is just a quantum leap.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about regulation. Randy, I was hoping to have you talk a bit about what you've been observing, especially with the regulators and any particular trends, especially as we're getting, right now we're around the device, but as we get more into the device.
Honestly, I haven't heard anything from like the FDA about this is how we're going to regulate generative AI right now. Like we said, it'll creep up, right? And these examples have all been given. It'll be used to generate test data. I know somebody was doing this with, they needed more x-rays to actually prove, it was really interesting that you can predict type 2 diabetes with a chest x-ray. Fascinating stuff. It'll come in that way. It'll come in through the Copilot tool, where it basically goes and finds example code for you, which is a pretty interesting use case. By the way, if any of your heads of engineering say to you, we're not using generative AI here, it's not proven yet, if you go to the individual engineers and ask them how many have used Copilot to pull in code, you're going to get a really high number. And if you ask them, well, was that a validated tool? They're just going to look at you and go, well, everybody uses it. What need to be validated? So this is already happening. What's the Bruce Sterling line from science fiction? The street finds a use for things. Engineers will find ways to use this, even if you think it's not there.
Hey, can I add a comment about the regulators? So I just recently read that there was over 500 AI ML products approved in the U.S. in the last 3 years, and that is greater than the previous 20 years combined. And there was this recent draft guidance, hopefully I won't butcher the name, but it's something like predetermined change control plan, just to ensure that companies can keep on upgrading their algorithms as they have their products approved. So I think regulators are aware that this is coming, and they're trying to work with industry to ensure it happens in a fast pace, to Rebecca's comment.
Yeah, just to add, I think to your point, beyond, I think last 10 years we have seen how deep learning has become an important component across how the products have gotten approved. I would say, yes, a lot of those principles still hold true, where you need to mitigate the bias in the data, need to have transparency, robustness to be able to evaluate across multiple sites, to be able to justify those benefits before they get into the actual workflow in itself. Beyond that, I would say specifically for GenAI, 2 additional components come in that are going to be critical. The first one is going to be reasoning or explanation. Why is that output generated? Because I think that's going to give more confidence to the clinicians, to the regulatory folks as well, whether they should be incorporated into the technology in itself as well. And the second point, I think, is more going to be on machine learning ops or ML ops to be able to monitor how the output is happening over time. Because yes, 500 models have been deployed, I would say over the last 3 to 5 years. But how about we actually monitor them so that they stay relevant and consistent over time as well? So a lot of these principles do apply to generic AI or deep learning as well, but more to do so with, especially with deep learning and generative AI.
So how do you ensure responsible AI in practice, right? There's many people using it or starting to think about how to deploy it. What are the mechanisms? You know, maybe Rebecca, we'll start with you, because I know Microsoft's been pretty vocal about responsible AI.
Yeah, this is something that we as Nuance took very seriously, and even more under Microsoft. And frankly, there's a whole process that we follow to ensure that anything that we're releasing to the market is, you know, done responsibly, that it's compliant, that it abides by HIPAA, GDPR, and any other regulatory regimes that we fall under. I would also add that we do take these releases very seriously, and we do go through a rigorous process around, you know, what do we release in private preview? How do we compose? What are the metrics that we're going to use to say, yes, it is ready to go to general availability, and have very, very rigorous metrics around that. The only other thing I would add around this is, and you've heard from the other panelists, you know, we also have been very, very clear that we don't cross a certain line. And you mentioned the line of it in Medtech is it in the machine? The note that we're providing the clinician has the clinician in the loop, right? Ultimately, the clinician, it could be, you know, a PA, it could be a doctor, is the one who has to review the note and ultimately sign off on it. And that is critical for us, because what we're doing is we're actually supporting them in a workflow, and we have to make sure that it's as good as it can be, but ultimately there is a human in the loop that's ultimately validating that output.
So this is a little staged because we started to have this conversation in the prep and we stopped, but it's like, okay, I'll jump in at this point with a comment. So I'll make 2 comments on 2 sides about humans in the loop. And I spent a lot of time before I was with this firm in diagnostic radiology and AI adoption. And, you know, the human in the loop is a very big thing. It's an assistive aid, right? It's not an autonomous diagnosis tool. First of all, just as a reminder, human beings as a gold standard aren't always gold, right? There's actually a really funny paper I read. Somebody wrote a fake academic paper on the evaluation of using human decision-making for important decisions, right? And it basically said, well, yeah, you know, we're starting to think about letting humans make decisions about like mortgage applications and, you know, safety of things and teaching children. So like, how do we know if they're going to make the right decision? Because they're biased, right? And they're emotional, and they're a black box. You don't understand what you're doing. So we need to keep that in mind on one side. It's not like there's a true gold standard that's actually pure gold. On the other side, I think there's just some basic cognitive science here, and I'm not an expert, but you know, I've seen enough to know humans learn to lean on tools as crutches, and then they forget how to do things in the first place. So I think the human in the loop works well until you get too comfortable with it, you know, and you start to depend on it. What I get concerned about is less the experienced radiologist who's done something for a long time and knows how to do it, and now is using a tool to speed it up. They still have a sniff test if something's wrong. They can go, that just doesn't feel right. I don't know what's wrong, but that doesn't feel right, and go back to the basics. But then we get to the thing which always happens, which is next we train a whole generation of residents who only know how to use the assistive tool. And they don't have a sniff test for what goes on. And that's where it starts to get interesting and scary. And the truth is that's happened a lot in medicine, but we're gonna all have to acknowledge up front that we're doing this. I really do believe human loop's important, but I don't believe it's a catch-all that will last us for 40 years.
Yeah, I just want to build on some comments. So I think one role medical device companies and hospital systems need to play is to ensure that the accuracy of the data going into these models. It has, because you know the outcomes mirror what went in. You know, I was just recently at a hospital system that was, you know, they had over 100,000 surgeries cataloged, annotated, amazingly valuable data to build algorithms. But I think it's one of our responsibilities in the industry and hospital systems to ensure that the data that goes in represents the global population, for example, so we don't build algorithms that are representative of a smaller cohort. So I think things like that have to be really sorted out well for us to make a big impact in clinical outcomes directly.
Oh, I would say to get to the original question of how do we approach this, I think it's the same tools that we've been using. I think this echoes the themes that people have been saying. It's the same tools we've been using. Peer review, right? Like everything that is being generated has to be peer reviewed. We make the only CME accredited video games, so everything we do with med device and life science companies all goes through medical, regulatory, legal review. You have to go through the same processes. You have to go through code review to make sure that the code that is generated is, you know, is stable and safe and everything else. I think the one difference, the one thing that is different when you're dealing with generative AI generated stuff is the fact that the reviewer needs to know that it is generative AI generated. And that's something we've discovered, is that if the editor doesn't know, things will get through because they assume human intent. And that assumption of human intent actually becomes problematic. So as in the examples we saw, that like it has no guilt about lying. In fact, it's happy to give you something very believable. And so that's why it's very, very important that the editors are on the lookout for that and they check everything, even the things that are being conveyed with true confidence.
Last question for me, and then we'll turn it to the audience. So obviously, this is quite a diverse panel already. There's a full ecosystem, which is rather new, I think, for Medtech. Maybe not for those of you on the stage, but this concept of we're not really deploying hardware, we're not creating hardware anymore. We have to start collaborating with a wide ecosystem of hyperscalers and large hospital systems to get the data. So I'm just curious, what's been your experience, and what do you think, if you were to predict the next 10 years, what will this industry need to do to build that ecosystem? Maybe Parminder, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I think especially the way GenAI has come and just building these large models in itself, I do think that it kind of brings out a really strong three-way partnerships that are going to be key. The first is going to be with medtech companies like us, J&J, and others that are going to be key components over there. The second is going to be on the clinical and research institutes. I think that's going to be the second pillar. For instance, we recently, last week, announced collaboration with Mayo Clinic on solving care pathway problems related to how do we really accelerate AI and build components for theranostics. Similarly, building AI and digital solutions in the case of Alzheimer's together. Couple of days back, we announced our premier photon counting CT technology, and now it's been actually deployed at Stanford, and now researchers are actually evaluating how it can really streamline the process and really help us to get to the next level of clinical validation across neurology, cardiology, and oncology. So I think that's the second pillar that's going to be really important for training, validation, and going through that entire life cycle. The third one is going to be with these hyperscalers and with the medtech company, with the tech companies, because that's going to help you scale components, and you can leverage a lot of core competencies that are out there and apply it to 100 different problems. So if I have to look from disease care pathway, if we solve a problem for Alzheimer's, how do we take it to 100 other neurodegenerative diseases? And I think that's where it's going to become important to use reusable components. So things like cloud computing and large models, which can be leveraged. In some of those use cases, you might want to build them from ground up, but in some cases, you might just want to customize them. So I think scaling it across is going to be key. And I think that's where these three-way partnerships is something that you would see more often in the future as well.
I can go next. I think something that's going to definitely change is, I think there's going to be much stronger partnerships between medical device companies, or medtech companies, and hospital systems, because the data, the valuable information sits in the hospitals, and I think how we develop products is going to reform and change, where there's going to be a lot more presence of medical device companies with working directly with hospital systems, even perhaps on the campuses, to ensure that the data is collected in an accurate, secure way.
So I continue the data topic as well as the speed topic, because I think one of the most important things is being extremely careful about bias in the input data. And Ahmed, you mentioned this earlier. Like, we continually see technologies, and GenAI is going to make this worse, exacerbating economic and racial disparities in healthcare. So we continually see pulse oximeters that don't work on darker skin tones, AI-based melanoma detection tools that don't work on huge ranges of the Fitzpatrick scale, and that's simply because the data going in was biased. And one of the challenges you run into is the necessity for speed means that we're continuing to exacerbate biases by putting bad data into the system. The upside is these technologies can be used to reduce those biases. Like, if you tag your data correctly, if you collect your data correctly, in some cases if you invest in generating unbiased data or filling in the gaps of your data set with female data or data of other underrepresented groups, right? Even if you simulate it artificially, you can address the problem, but that requires a deliberate effort. And if we continue, so it's going to boil down to the people in this room, right, making active decisions of, do we focus on speed or do we focus on the quality of data and reducing bias, because that's going to have a huge impact on overall the impact that all this has on society.
One last collaboration, I'll actually say this is a very optimistic one. I think our industry does an amazing job of collaborating with regulators to find solutions together for the next problem. And it's not just, I'm always amazed at the FDA and how they say, yeah, we agree this is the problem, go solve it, we'll give you some support and guidance. And when you come back with the answer, as long as it looks good and we're in the same range, we'll adopt that as our method. A lot of that's going to happen. It's actually, I have to say, from my personal involvement with the first standards or guidance around cloud computing, putting medical devices on cloud computers, you can actually really have an impact and not just be a victim. So like when there's the NPR pledge drive, they always say that they talk to you and they're like, we say call in and give $5 or $5, and people actually never call in until they realize, oh, they're talking to me. Like, I'm supposed to give the $5. I thought it was the person in the next car. We're talking to you. All of you who are working on this will have good experience and can actively contribute to these things. That will make a big difference in how long this stuff takes and how soon we can get these into patients' bodies, essentially for better outcomes.
And if I could add just a few comments on the way we look at the ecosystem and the key partnerships we need to have. Deep integration partnership with the EHR providers. And thinking about, what are the other ways that we can leverage these generative AI tools in the case of way beyond documentation, because once you have that documentation and it has been reviewed, what are the next set of things that you can start doing? Teeing up orders, helping to potentially diagnose some discrepancies between medication. So if you think about the next generation things, really working closely with the EHR vendors, and we've publicly shared that we do quite a bit of work with Epic, and they're already looking at some of these use cases. The second thing that has me quite optimistic is thinking about what are other populations that we can support and help with these kinds of tools. And so a lot of our work has been focused on the clinician. We are now extending that to nursing. And if you think of where there is pain in the system right now, and if you even look at some of the strikes that are happening on this side of the continent, nursing is another area where, if you think about, you can combine that conversational piece, something ambient, and now you overlay GenAI that is able to extract information into what are typically nurse flow sheets. You actually might have a solution that is alleviating yet another cognitive load of folks that are on their feet all the time working with patients. And so stay tuned, more to come on that. And then the third thing that gets me excited, and if you follow where care is going to get delivered to each and every one of us in this room as we age, it likely will not be in hospitals. It likely is going to be outside of the hospital. It might actually be at home. And if you think of this technology that we can now deliver at scale, on our phones, over the cloud, I am very, very optimistic that we'll be able to do some very interesting things to help each and every one of us stay healthy as long as we can.
Very much. And so on that optimistic note, we'll turn it to the audience and see if there's any other questions.
Don't make us ask ChatGPT for questions.
Hi.
We have two.
Oh, good.
Ashok Kapoor from Hawkeye Medtech. We have a telehealth platform bringing healthcare closer to where people live and work. And my question about AI is good and bad depending on how it's implemented, how it gives recommendations. For example, in ICU, where hundreds of data points are being collected for the patient, right? AI can actually predict somebody going into this, probably into almost like coding stage and be able to alert that to an intensivist. But on the other side, generative AI and others, if not implemented right, can take a provider into a wrong rabbit hole, for example, in image analysis, ignore some of the data points and take them to some other place where, so in AI, unless we provide providers with what were the differential diagnosis or things that was ignored and what were the decision trees, all the decisions it may just give an output and not exactly what was ruled out, what was not. What do you think about providing all that data to the provider so they know what decision paths were taken and what were ignored?
Does anyone disagree that we should provide the decision tree?
Yeah, I would add, I think, a couple of things. One of the greatest advantages, at least with GenAI, I think that's come out more than just, I think there's been a lot of discussions on the tech side of things, but these technologies are truly multimodal in nature. So it's been built to be multimodal, and I think that's where it becomes kind of critical is, so we're talking about, I think, how the data from different places got aggregated. We can think about how GenAI and some of these technologies can actually be used for synthesizing the information. So you can get data from different sources, but GenAI can actually help you synthesize data coming from different modalities in a meaningful way. So that can be the first step, even before when we go to the diagnosis side of things as well. In today's, even right now, we have 97% of the data, even when we store, that's not used for a variety of reasons. So I think which data is going to be relevant for specific use cases, I think that's going to be an interesting area from generative AI perspective. You can have images, you can ask questions about that, ask in a natural language, and to be able to get those answers and bring that throughout the continuum of care for different disease pathways. I think that's going to be key component where it's going to be more of an enabler. So the way I would think about this is, as a starting step, is like enhanced search engine. That's more multimodal in nature. And now you can ask questions with data coming from structured parts of the EHR, coming from the images, coming from the text in itself.
I think this notion that AI is necessarily an opaque black box where you ask it a question, it gives you an answer, is a myth. Probably propagated by certain companies that are building products that way, but there's no reason it needs to work that way. If you look at, actually you can analyze a lot, even just looking at the neural network. You can look at the word embeddings. You can figure out if a system has bias or not. Like, there's all sorts of analysis you can do. You can have it show its work. And the important thing is, again, when we're making these systems, just making sure that you're being transparent throughout. How does it work? What data are you training it on? How have you tested it? And this is, I think, key to overcoming what is going to be an obstacle to adoption, which is fear and lack of trust. And the way you're going to build that is through transparency and by making systems that show their work.
I'd also say, just because you're flying below the FDA radar, so to speak, and you're saying, well, it's not a device, I don't have to tell you this. I'm sure it's true because you guys have great products. That doesn't mean anything goes, right? You still have quality. And the truth is that there's a lot of techniques we use in the regulated medical device space that I think have a lot of value, risk analysis and certain things that we're required to do that would be very healthy in other places. And oh, by the way, if you put some of those things in place now, that means when the time comes when we can move generative AI into above the FDA radar, all that data and work you've collected will be usable. But if you have no provenance, you have no chain of custody, you haven't figured out what you've done and who did what and where it came from, you're going to have to throw it out and start all over, right? But if you lay the foundation now with something that probably you should be doing anyway, you'll be in a really good position when the time comes.
And you know what could help you with that risk analysis? Generative AI. Whoa.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Eleanor Kiria. I'm in the talent space. So I'm interested to know, what jobs do you see being created, or what kind of people are you going to need to hire in this world of generative AI and medtech?
I can start. I think we're going to hire a lot of people that has similar titles to him on the screen if it's there. I would say the next 10 years, Medtech is going to become a lot more software engineering driven organizations, for sure. I think, people that are studying computer science now in college, I think are going to have very interesting careers. I don't think the other skills are going to go away, because I view it as the medical device industry used to be devices and implants. Now, you're still going to need devices and implants, but we're going to add this other modality of, people call it different things, surgical guidance, augmented surgery. And for all of that, where generative AI is a part of, you're going to need a lot of strong software capabilities in MedTech, which I think is what's happening already in the sector.
Sorry, I can't resist. I did see a fake job ad. Someone did a parody from OpenAI for a kill switch engineer. And
that was great.
And your job is to basically believe completely in everything OpenAI is doing and how they're doing it, but to stand next to the power plug, and in case it actually turns against us, yank the power plug.
Because that worked great in movies. That just solved the problem. Then.
The only other thing I would add in terms of the skill sets that our customers are telling us they need is the skill set that actually fundamentally understands the problem you're trying to solve and actually can translate it into what are the tools that you need to use. And it's funny, maybe connect both questions. We hosted an event with the American Academy of Healthcare on collaborative AI and had the top hospital systems together in Boston a few weeks back. And it was striking the level of conversation that we had, not about the tech, but about culture, about governance, about how you figure out what the right tool is that is actually driving the right outcome that is actually driving value for your organization. I do think underclubbing that skill set is a mistake. And it goes back to, I think, some of the things you quoted, the concept of why am I doing this? What outcome am I driving? Am I actually making life better for the doctors? Am I actually creating, time in their day? Am I actually driving better satisfaction? Those are really important skills to have, and figure out what tools you actually deploy from a software perspective to solve those problems.
Hello.
I think that'll be our last question, so go ahead.
Yes, I'll keep it quick. Thank you for such a wonderful panel. I'm Joe Zabinski from OM1. I run our AI business unit. We've started to explore data with generative AI, particularly around the things that lead to clinical decisions. And something we've observed is that sometimes what the system tells us happens or should have happened actually disagrees with what the clinician did. Sometimes because of mistakes on the Gen AI side or the clinician side, but sometimes because there's something non-obvious or non-intuitive going on. Sometimes it's different at the practice level, right? A GP might say something different from a specialist. As these systems get smarter, my question for you is, how do you foresee dealing with situations where even with the best transparency and explainability, we get to a result that differs from what the expert wants to do, but that might actually be better for the patient?
I think explainability is one of the first components, but the other is, I think, on the other paradigm of retrieval augmented generation, where there is a ground truth, and how do you ground that generation that is coming out to the real world information. So I think, as I was mentioning earlier, you can think of this as an enhanced companion or a search engine that can give you the right information, or for instance, if it refers to actual clinical trials that were done, yes, it might summarize 2 to 3, but actually giving information about that. I think that's going to be key component as we'll build some of these technologies. And there's a lot of work on LangChain and retrieval augmented generation that started to happen already, where GenAI as an output is going to be useful, and then you give the complementary information, and at the end, it will still be somewhat human in the loop as we'll work on some of these technologies.
I would completely agree. I think that we're not any near to telling a physician or a surgeon what to do. I think it will be a guidance, a suggestion, but I don't see a scenario in the next decade where we will be recommending to reverse a decision that they're making in the OR. I think it will always be in the form of a guidance.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much to our panel. Obviously, we could talk about this for hours. Hopefully, next year we'll have plenty more examples of great GenAI products and services. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank our moderator.